we've returned to the big map of Europe and European Russia now. We're going to ask ourselves some really big questions about what the long-term historical consequences would have been had Operation Barbarossa played out differently. Chris Parry, to start with you on this. I suppose one thing we should consider, what if Operation Barbarossa never happened?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think if Barbarossa hadn't happened, the Germans would have permanently thought about the thought of the Russians actually building up their military strength, actually encroaching into the Baltic and the Black Sea regions even more into German sphere of influence, and possibly attacking them at some stage 2 years later. And there's evidence to suggest that Stalin was actually thinking about that as well. So that's a distinct possibility that they would have had this thought in their back. What certainly would have happened, I think, is that the Germans would have said, look, we've got to take out Great Britain.
Yeah.
If we don't bring it to terms, or we don't actually invade, it's always going to be a problem. It's going to be a 700-mile long aircraft carrier in case the Americans want to get involved. And at some stage we may have to take on the Americans, so we can't have that sitting there alone like that. I think we've got to believe what the Germans said they would do. They would run us out of the Mediterranean. That's the first thing. They would take Malta and Gibraltar. That's what they said they would do. They would probably try and get Turkey involved in the war at some stage so that they can penetrate into Iran and the Middle East. They're hoping that Rommel and everybody is going to come around from the south through Syria and Palestine. And Hitler is openly talking about driving into India from Afghanistan and Iran, even while this is going on. The big mistake, of course, which everybody missed, is just as the Battle of Moscow is being won by the Russians, of course, there's Pearl Harbor.
Yes,
and
indeed.
4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declares war on the United States. so if you haven't got enough problems here, OK, let's take on the United States now. We're going to have to do it one day, so let's do it now. And we are being loyal to Japan and Italy in that sense.
Well, Pearl Harbor's a massive what if, and obviously we're going to talk about that very soon, actually, on History Undone, so stay tuned for that episode. We've got a dedicated episode all about Pearl Harbor. I suppose almost what you're saying, Chris, is that Hitler was always bound to invade somewhere. He's like a shark. He's always got to move forward. If it's not Russia, he'd go for the UK or he'd go for North Africa. You've
got to bear in mind that by this stage, Germany has become a heavily militarised society. Right at the core of their national identity is this old Prussian warfare sort of ethos that they've got. And unless they keep expanding, they're going to contract. They also need the resources. So they're going to have to come to terms with the Russians somehow and say, look, while we're holding you at length, we do want your resources. And Hitler famously said, if we can't maintain access to those resources, we're going to take them. So it may have happened later on rather than at the time. But right now, I think the Germans will consolidate in Europe here. They're still pushing for Lebensraum in the east here. There's no question about that. And at some stage, the Germans would have had to expand east to get the resources, both in terms of land, but agricultural land, but also in terms of raw materials and things like that.
Well, let's talk about another big what if, Evan. What if Operation Barbarossa does succeed? And however you define that is quite interesting, but we touched in the beginning that Hitler wanted to essentially crush the Soviet Union. So let's say that happens. What are the consequences? What does that mean for the rest of the war?
So I think if the overall objectives of Operation Barbarossa had succeeded, and I think that's unlikely to have happened, but it could have happened. For other reasons, the Soviet Union could have collapsed. But in any event, if Russia was no longer in the war, if most of European Russia was occupied by the Germans, then it would have all kinds of major consequences. It would have, there would no longer be any supply problems for the Third Reich. It would have had adequate supplies of both minerals, but also in particular of grain. It would have food resources to survive for a very long time. Britain would be knocked out of the war. The whole point of the campaign, in some respects, had been to convince the British government that there was no way in which it could keep fighting once Russia had been knocked out of the war. Once Russia goes, I think it would be reasonable to expect either some change in British policy, a removal of the Churchill government, and finding a government that would come to some kind of terms with Hitler, like Vichy France, or in which Britain was actually invaded. It was impossible to invade Britain in 1940, or to have a successful air campaign against Britain in 1940 or 1941. That would have been possible in 1942, I think. So it would have been hard for Britain to survive. If Britain doesn't survive as an anti-German entity, then I can't see any way in which a counteroffensive could have been launched at a strategic level against Nazi Germany by the United States or anybody else. So I think the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union would have been enormous in historical terms.
Chris Parry, what are the Russians doing? I mean, we say in this scenario that the Soviet Union has essentially collapsed, but there must be some form of Russian government. What, they retreat into the Urals?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the line that Germans postulated, Archangel here through to Astrakhan, so you're losing quite a lot of your population here. And part of the German plan was to annihilate 30 million Russians to make sure that the food supplies were adequate for them in the initial stages. So what has happened, though, is quite a lot of the industry has been taken back behind the Urals. I think quite a lot of the population there would have been mobilized. And we've got to remember that beyond the Urals, there's quite a substantial state that can exist. And for the Germans to extend that all that way before they've consolidated this huge fortress Europe that they would be able to set up, and Evan's right, you know, if you've got access to all the resources you need, you're in an autarkic situation. You're self-contained here. You don't have to worry about all the things that crush the Germans and their allies in World War I. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of the Russians to basically rehabilitate, to restore capability behind the Urals, and at some stage come back very hard with their material and their manpower to retake some of this. It's not important to think the Russians might have won that, but to think that it's a constant sore that the Germans are having to deal with. So you've got this huge pressure from the east coming on. You've got to commit lots of resources to defending and holding down this area. And I think that would have been a continued sort of drain on German resources at some stage. So we've got to think about that. I think the other thing one has to bear in mind is what Japan would have done.
Yeah. Do they suddenly think, hang on a minute, we've got a weakened Russia, we'll attack it from the east?
Well, I think the key thing for Japan is it gives them a free hand in China. And also in Southeast Asia as well. If they haven't got a threat from Russia or Russia is vulnerable, then the Japanese can get on with what they want to do in Manchuria. And I think that's the important factor there. We mentioned earlier, of course, that December 1941 coincides with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Again, how does Russia sitting behind the Urals or even in the west here, up to Gorky or something like that, how does that affect it? Well, it does affect it because the United States is actually supplying quite a lot of material to Russia as well, going in through Vladivostok. How do the Japanese see that at that stage? Because the Japanese let Russian ships go all the way into Vladivostok throughout the Second World War because they weren't at war with them. And so Russian ships taking American material were absolutely unhindered in the east. So there's the ability to actually supply them. But the loss of the Arctic convoys, the possible threat to Iran, meaning we can't actually take supplies in from America and Britain into Russia, makes it very difficult indeed. But I wouldn't underestimate the ability of Asiatic Russia to come back and be a real problem here in the east.
Evan, Operation Barbarossa is famously often cited as a real turning point in the Second World War. So had it gone differently, had it been a success for the Germans, are we saying that Nazi Germany wins the Second World War? Are we going that far?
I think possibly you could. I mean, I think that, just going back a second to Chris's point, the parallel that I would see with, behind the Urals is kind of like China in 1940-41 after well, 1939, 40, when in fact China does give up the whole coastal area, most of eastern China, and falls back in effect to behind the Urals to Chongqing, and it really plays only a minor role in the rest of the war. I mean, the Japanese have a field army in China, but they're never under that great pressure. But to answer your question directly, I think probably it would have made the Second World War very different. I think America would have had to fall back on what they call hemispheric defense, but I can see it would be very difficult for the Americans to restore the position in Europe. I think the position in the Far East is a bit different, but even then, I don't think there's. I mean, I think the British Empire might have survived. The Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I think that they might have survived as an entity fighting with the United States. But I really can't see I would think the European war would come to an end when Russia is knocked out of it, if it is knocked out of it by the German armies.
That's really fascinating. Yeah.
Hitler's logic is right. If I knock out Russia, Britain's really in a desperate position. So he's absolutely right. And if they're able to consolidate here and get all the resources that are available, the population, all the sort of Nazi ideology and the racial ideology as well, you've got a Germanic domination here for probably decades.
Obviously, what happened after the Second World War, Chris, was the Cold War with the Soviet Union, because it emerged so powerfully from the Second World War. But the Cold War doesn't happen, therefore, under this scenario.
Well, it's quite interesting, because if you say Barbarossa doesn't happen, and let's say Stalin does attack Germany in, say, 1943 and 1944, what happened at the end of the Second World War is a real possibility. Because if they actually knock Germany out, they don't stop till they get to the Atlantic.
They're even more powerful.
Yeah. So if Germany doesn't attack the Soviet Union, there's a good chance that later on, when it really became powerful, got all its armaments going, took on Germany, actually did what it did in 43, 44, and just keeps driving west. And of course, what stopped them? Two things. One was obviously a massive American conventional power, but also the fact that we had a nuclear device. So again, there's a road to go down there. At what stage do you say, look at this vast German entity here, we need something bigger and better than conventional forces to deter it in the first place and defeat it secondly?
So the Cold War would have been a Cold War between the US and Nazi Germany?
Well, no, I think it would have been a Cold War, I think, if things had rolled out between the US, Canada, if you like, the British Empire, but maybe not Britain, and also a massive Soviet thrust into Western Europe if they brushed aside. So what I'm saying to you is, if Barbarossa hadn't happened, a reverse Barbarossa probably would have done about 3 years afterwards.